all acknowledge everybody who's here. Thank you to all of you for joining. There are so many of you who are part of my class on innovation models for building inclusive business. There are several others who are in the Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy program, the Master of International Business program, the Master of Laws program, the Master of Global Business Administration program. We have students scattered around the world. And my first question to all of you is, I hope you're all doing okay. I hope you're all doing okay, all right? And I hope people who are close to you and people whom you can reach out to and at least check in on their well-being are all doing okay. And do keep checking on them if you haven't seen them directly. And those who are high risk, don't see them directly. So that's my kind of quick homily at the start of this call. And if anybody separately would like to get in touch and talk about just how things are going, my line is completely open. You guys know where to reach me. I would like to spend our time getting into the conversation, and before we get too deep, I'm sure there's nobody on this on this Zoom room who does not know the company Unilever, and perhaps there's nobody in this room who has not been touched by a Unilever product. I remember I grew up in a different century, in a different part of the world relative to where I'm sitting right now, and I remember one of the earliest jingles from my childhood, and those of you who understand Hindi will probably remember the jingle. Tandurusti ki raksha karta hai life boy hai jahan tandurusti hai wahan. So health is protected by the life boy, and wherever there is life boy, there is health. And we wish that was true today, but I think it is indeed fitting to have the former CEO and the CEO of Lifebuoy, along with hundreds and hundreds of other products that have been spread out around the world across 190 plus countries. Paul Polman is here with us. So let me just open this with a thank you to Paul for taking time out of a very, very busy time. And I know that this is also not the best time for you since you are in Central European time. So thank you for that. Let me give you the floor, Paul. Spend a little bit of time just helping us situate where you are. What are you doing these days? And what's on top of your
thanks. No, thanks, Bhaskar, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity. And obviously, I'd like to echo the most important thing is that you and your dear ones are all safe. These are challenging times, but also great times of reflection and hopefully thinking about things, that we have an opportunity to redesign an economic system that is coming out better than how we went into this crisis in the first place. And I'm very pleased, and that was attractive to me to be part of your class where you talk about inclusive businesses. And we have to talk a little bit about what that means in the end, but we need more than ever a private sector that is more responsible and part of a system that works for more people, more sustainable, more equitable, intergenerational, and undoubtedly we're going to talk about that. What I focus on actually since I left Unilever, and I'll leave the discussion of the case study for a few minutes later, so I won't get into that now, but what I found when I was in Unilever, that increasingly I needed to spend more time on driving transformative changes in society that lead to the systems changes that we need. Many of the things we are doing is within the system, and it leads to linearity, it leads to incrementalism, and it leads to playing not to lose. That is one of the reasons why we are so behind on many, if not most, of the Sustainable Development Goals targets. So I created a foundation called Imagine, which basically works with CEOs on a sectorial level across the value chain. And our theory of change is that we try to get 25 to 30% of the CEOs together, obviously leading CEOs of companies that want to move forward, and collectively we're trying to change systems. A company alone can perhaps do 30, 40% of what the citizens of this world are demanding from them. If they go together in a value chain or industry levels, they might get to 60, 70%, but ultimately we need to work across all sectors, civil society, governments, and private sector to make the real tipping points or changes that are needed. Especially, we're focused especially on climate change and inequality. We started by putting the fashion industry together, 64 companies now, over 35% of the industry, working on net zero by 2050, which is to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is getting out of single-use plastics and looking at the third point is regenerative cotton. Those would be type of the elements. We focus on 5 industries: fashion, food and land use. Very important now because of the COVID crisis and focus on health. We're actually seeing a looming food crisis coming. And then we focus on tourism and travel, a little bit difficult now. We focus on finance and we focus on tech. What I'm actually working in the current weeks, where I thought it would be a little bit easier working at home, it's probably the opposite, and I'm sure you all find the same, is that we're working actively on the COVID crisis, where we are putting coalitions together and working coalitions of businesses to accelerate the involvement in the COVID crisis. In one of my spare times, I happen to be the chairman of the International Chambers of Commerce, which is 45 million companies represented there. I also am the vice chair for the Secretary General for the UN Global Compact, and I chair something that's called the B Team. So what we're trying to do now is bring the private sector together at scale to get involved behind this crisis, focused on the short-term health, but also on the vulnerable people and on the longer-term solutions. And that takes quite a lot of time, as you can imagine. Being out there, doing the advocacy, working especially with the G20. I'm one of the co-chairs of the B20. As you well know, the G20 this year is done by Saudi, so we're helping them get in an aggressive agenda. And the same is true for the G7 or the EU, so that we ensure that in a time that we see increasing nationalism or shrinking back to our own borders, that we handle a crisis like this with a global mindset. Unfortunately, 54 countries have erected trade barriers on emergency medical supply, which is the wrong thing to do. And and the same is happening with food now, Russia the other day. So if these borders are not open, if we cannot have this free flow of these materials, we're not going to get to the bottom of this issue at the speed that is required. So these are the things that keep me busy, on top of trying to lose weight and eating healthy and spending some time on all the other NGOs I work with and other things, which have all seen their funding dry up, and try to discover how they can stay alive. And we need them, because it's especially these organizations in the philanthropic fields, be it working with the blind, or be it organizations like Oxfam or Save the Children, that are needed to bring these economies up again, because they're closely connected to the most vulnerable people. And we need to be sure that that we support them as much, and that they are not falling by the wayside in this tough situation that we find ourselves. I'll leave it here for the interest of time.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for sharing that. I'm sure a very tiny peephole into the much larger set of experiences that you are now involved with. You mentioned the NGOs and many of these enterprises in the social sector that are working with the most vulnerable populations. We also recognize that in this period of crisis, many of them are themselves among the more vulnerable. And many of our students across the room, they have either worked for those organizations or they're considering working in those organizations. Is there any kind of a navigation guide, Paul, that you could offer to help us think about how these NGOs in the social sector that are doing such enormously important and critical work that others will not do, and it is so necessary today? What do you see as the prospects for the sector in the medium term, assuming this is the tunnel that is not going to last forever? We are going to see daylight at the other end. And as we come into the daylight, what do you see as the prospects for the sector on the other side of the tunnel, and then as we drive further away from the tunnel?
Well, what we have now seen, especially now, I could give you two sides of an answer, but let's go through this for a second. I think that this current crisis has exposed the underbelly of our economic system and the vulnerability that we still find too many people in, either excluded from the economic system or very fragile. The gig economy has made many people independent, hourly workers. Many people, like in the food chain, are actually in the informal economy. And whilst governments are putting plans in place, like the 2.2 trillion in the US, we have about 5 trillion globally that goes behind this crisis. It's these most vulnerable that are still exposed and often not included. The second thing that is happening is that we are sitting here and making big statements and plans to not have import barriers or export barriers. But at the end of the day, the real thing happens on the ground, in the local communities, in the families. And that is often where the philanthropic sector or the NGO community is at work. And that is like we are seeing probably 30% of the SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises, disappearing under this enormous pressure on the operations, on the cash flow, on their businesses. I think you'll see also a bigger shakeout in the NGO community. And frankly, it's already happening from my antennas out there. And my wife and myself have 3 NGOs, so we know how tough that is. But on the other hand, I have a little bit of a light in the future, and I see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's like with so many things, we can decide what we want it to be and how we react to these things. And I think that more and more businesses are starting to understand that a business model that is more focused on multi-stakeholder versus the shareholder alone. We're seeing enormous rallying cries from businesses to go together to address some of these tragedies of the commons, if you want to call them that way. And I think it actually opens up longer term more opportunities for these NGOs to work with these companies as they start to embrace these multi-stakeholder models. So tough in the interim. And what we need to avoid then is that the right NGOs are not going out of business, so to speak, but that they can exist through this for the next 6, 12 months, may I say, and then come out hopefully stronger in that new world that we need to create.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for that ray of hope. And so let's go back to in time and take you back to a point when you were at Unilever. And if I could ask the room to maintain the following protocol. If you could all mute your screens, and if I could also ask the students in the class to be ready to unmute, and because I would hope that we can actually engage in a discussion about some of the critical issues that Paul and his colleagues were facing at Unilever. And the participants who are not from the class, if you could remain muted till the end of our session, when we'll have an opportunity to do an open discussion and a Q&A, I would greatly appreciate that. So let's go back in time. And Paul, you set us off perfectly talking about the various stakeholders. There are stakeholders that are critical for any kind of a larger systemic change process. And we got a window into Unilever and its own experiment, initiative, strategy, whatever we call it, of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, the USLP, which you launched in the middle of a crisis. And you were obviously a student of Machiavelli, never let a crisis go to waste. Or maybe a student of Rahm Emanuel. Many people have used that phrase. And of course, we have an opportunity to use a crisis yet again, but we'll get to that. So the USLP is something that we have all spent quite a bit of time digging into to try and understand what the original motivations for putting it in place were and how it performed in the first few years. And we know that the performance was uneven. There were places where there were some tremendous successes and some places where not so much. Now, it turns out that I have a number of my students who have lots of questions about USLP. And so if I could ask Shahryar Shah, if you could help us make the case for, from the perspective of shareholders, as to why you think this is not such a good idea. And let's go back to 2014, 2015, the time frame of the case, and imagine you are there, and imagine that Mr. Polman is still the CEO of Unilever. And how would you argue from a shareholder's perspective that this is not a good idea, in fact, maybe even a terrible idea for Unilever to persist with it?
Hey, thank you, Bhaskar. Thank you for being here, Paul. This is really a great opportunity. So putting myself into the boots of a shareholder, I would say that my main arguments is that this kind of a transformative change is really something that requires a long-term view and requires a lot of upfront costs. And this sort of a transformation wouldn't necessarily yield into value that me as a shareholder would really receive for the time being. And as such, I wouldn't really want to pursue such transformative change, especially right now while the growth is slowing as it is. And really, just from a profitability perspective, I wouldn't really see I don't see clearly the argument for doing this kind of a change at this moment.
So what your concerns about profitability, what are you drawing on, Shahryar? Why you worried? This is a company that seems to have done pretty well in the first few years of launching this USLP.
Sure, let me just find it.
And if somebody, just as a rule, if somebody from Shahryar's group, if you would like to support him in the argument, just jump in, put up your blue hand and jump in.
Right. I had it highlighted, but I just can't find that section. There was just a, so particularly it was successful in some areas, this sort of change, but there were two key points that were kind of red flags, particularly dealing with the greenhouse gases, as well as the water usage, and sort of the metrics related to that kind of like pulled up a red flag in my head as to whether or not this kind of a change would be successful, and whether or not that would kind of trickle downstream as an investor.
But let me understand a little bit before. Yeah, but let me understand a little bit before we go in it. The difference of being on track or not on track on targets versus your concern of upfront costs might not be the same. So it needs to be a little bit better understood. And then a follow-up question, if I may, since we're on it, a follow-up question would be, if you are that concerned, which is valid, there are definitely shareholders that would agree with your concern expressed like that. What are some of the things that you would not like a company like this to do that you see them doing right now? Where would you be saying what activities need to be cut out?
So back to you, Shahryar. If I could ask somebody from Shahryar's group to help us work through this. Sujay, what do you think?
By the way, to give this group confidence, there is a group of shareholders. I will explain how many in the end, but there is a group of shareholders who would actually agree with you and would applaud you for saying, I would not want to invest in a company like that. But now, since you are that shareholder, you have an opportunity to explain why.
Well, like,
okay, Sujay, are you muted? You need to unmute. I can unmute you here.
Hi. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry.
Okay, I think Sujay, yeah, go ahead, Sujay. Okay, I think Sujay's connection is not great. All right, Gene,
think
would you like to weigh in here?
I can try. Am I muted?
All right,
so
ahead,
like
sir.
I'm just trying to put myself back into the views of a shareholder in 2014, and I think a lot of this uncertainty really just has to do with the whole idea of corporate social responsibility being a strategy that can be driven through like from the company level all the way down to like across the value chain, and specifically absorbing the corporate social responsibility into a company at this level, and then seeing those sort of downstream impacts is kind of where all this uncertainty comes from, because it's just so radical that, like, for me in 2014, I just don't see there being the strong enough case for it from my perspective, versus doing something much more traditional in terms of shareholder value, which could be reducing costs in a more conventional manner. But
okay, all right. So why don't we take a pause here? Thank you, Shahryar, for being brave enough to step into the gladiatorial arena and being willing to be eaten alive by the lion here. So thank you. Let me just give you a round of applause here for it. And everybody,
Absolutely.
join me in helping and Shahryar helping us sort of get going. But perhaps we can get Paul some support from shareholders who feel a little bit differently. Shareholders who feel that this was actually a pretty good idea from a shareholder perspective. And do you want to jump in here and make the case for supporting Paul in this?
Sure. First of all, also thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to speak with us. This is a really special opportunity. So in response to what Shahryar has said, I think one thing we feel pretty strongly about is that the idea of being forced to choose between sustainability and profits falsely dichotomizes these two ideas, and continuing to invest in sustainability will actually lead to, we think, higher stock prices, which is what shareholders are ultimately interested in. And looking at the case on page 11, I believe it was, we saw that looking at it was mentioned the sales growth declined between 2012 and 2014. However, the sustainable living brands actually grew twice as fast as the rest, and were responsible for half of the overall growth. So this is an indication that shifting to focusing on sustainability ingrained in these business models is actually driving growth. So that's one point we think is pretty important. And I think there are a number of areas to draw upon on why we think this shift in strategy is really important, not only for the business model, but also for driving change in the industry, in the consumer industry. And one point we would like to make is acknowledging the importance of having great leadership. And that's something that we've, in our other cases, we've certainly found to be true, that a leader like Paul in driving the vision of the company is really important for engaging the employees, engaging the consumers, and really helps drive forward the growth. Another thing that has mentioned pretty clearly in the case, and we think is very true, is the importance of prioritizing the consumer needs and the environment, as well as engaging and motivating employees. And ultimately through this, we'll see that as shareholders, we will be rewarded. And we think this is a really, really important aspect that will be true, and we'll find to be true, and growth will continue to increase.
Okay, so thank you. Great, thank you, Anne, for that very heartfelt defense of the CEO. I guess I'm struck by the fact that you believe in his leadership, even though he refuses to give quarterly guidance to analysts. So you don't have a checkpoint every quarter, and so this belief is there's a suspended suspension of disbelief, shall we say. The other thing that I am a little worried about, as you look at the numbers, particularly when I go to the first exhibit of the case on page something, exhibit 1, basically, page 13. I look at the growth rates for Unilever, and it's a little bit worrisome from a shareholder's perspective, because the underlying sales growth has started out really nicely. It was 6.9% in 2012. It dropped to 4.3% in 2013, dropped even further to 2.9% in 2014. As a shareholder, you look at trends, long-term trends, and does this not worry you?
Actually, I would like to defend my team. So we believe that in general, building sustainability is a long-term goal and target. And in order to see some kind of results, we have to be patient. And moreover, I would like to add that by building sustainability, we are building resilience in order our company can be ready to answer to some disruptions, such as what we are going to do when we are going to have high oil prices, or when we are going to have natural disasters and our value chain is disrupted in general. So, of course, at the beginning, we are doing some extra expensive for investments, but I think at the end, what it values more is the response of the producers and all the small players of the value chain, and how these small players can improve the developing countries that we have invested in for this kind of sustainability. And actually, through this growth, we can earn more, bigger market share, bigger, customers in general, because the life level and how people live in those developing countries will be better in the long term and not in the short term. And I would like to add some points regarding the how profitable it's gonna be this. And I thought that the decision of not reporting quarterly results actually make the hedge funds that they want really short-term returns to go away, and actually to reduce the holdings of the Unilever shares significantly in the short term, and actually be patient to see the returns from the sustainable investments in the future, in the long term period.
Okay, so thank you, Konstantin. I think if I were to sort of encapsulate your very strong argument here, is you are taking the long view, and the the lack of the quarterly return sort of takes the eye off of the constant cycle of trying to meet those short-term expectations and gets you acclimatized to the fact that this is an investment that I'm making and that is going to deliver in the future, and you still have confidence in the company's ability to do that. Let's see if Priyank has a point to add. Priyank, chime in here.
Yeah, actually, I am in Anne and Constantine's team only. So we are all the proponent of Paul's decision. And what I personally feel over here is that in case if you, if the profit numbers are kind of, I would say the curve is flattening, going by the term in the market these days, I would say that's happening just because probably we are in a market that's saturated. And either you want to grow over there, then probably you would want to launch, take your company to another location, launch a new product, or improve on the process so that you can get your profits better. And looking at it from a very long-term point of view, that's why probably they were not, Paul wasn't in the, like he wasn't supportive of releasing quarterly figures, because he feels the results will be seen in the long term. And if the investor understands it, only then they should come forward for it. And somewhere even looking at the time when the case is written, around the time we're talking about 2014, 2015, I feel that there is a trend that was noticed during that time, where moving forward also, the companies won't really be recognized only solely based upon what is the price of the product. The consumers are also becoming aware that the product that they're consuming, what are the values of the company, and what is being done by the company, and how is it affecting them. So I think it was a move that was taken at the right time, and it was much needed.
Okay, thank you, Priyank. So one concern that I would continue to flag here is that the question about whether the consumer is getting it, because what we are seeing is a softness in both the advanced markets, but also in the emerging markets, and that softness is kind of part of the slowdown, or the explanation behind the slowdown that we're experiencing in 2014. Nate, what do you think? What's going on in your mind?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so one of the things that I noticed from looking at the case was that it highlighted a couple times how P&G was overtaking Unilever from the perspective of stock price, and I think it may or may not have been increasing, its revenue growth may have been faster. But what it doesn't say in the case is whether or not P&G had undergone a similar like CSR sustainability initiative. I'm wondering, as from an investor perspective, would they sort of worried about what Unilever is doing right now from the perspective of how their chief competition is doing? And so I wanted a thought on that.
So as a shareholder, how would that, the comparative evaluation of P&G's performance relative to Unilever, how does that make you feel about Unilever stock? Do you feel favorably disposed, or are you concerned?
I think at the moment, because, yeah, I mean, at the moment, because P&G appears to be overtaking it, I think like you would be a bit worried. But I think it's also a question if Unilever is trying something interesting, and has P&G done that in the past already? Or like, what are they doing at the same time?
Okay.
And
yeah, so
talk about that, so.
Okay, yeah, the case doesn't give us a whole lot of insight into that. Of course, you can do outside research and do a side-by-side comparison to the extent that the stock price is an indicator of the market's expectations of long-term earnings. That doesn't say a whole lot about sustainability and how that is playing a role across these competing companies. But we'll have a chance to sort of come back to that when we actually hear from Paul about how some of those issues are playing out inside the conference rooms at Unilever, or in the markets in 190 countries where they compete. Ali, what's up?
Can I ask,
where are you on this debate? Please go ahead, Paul.
Paul, do you want to say something?
No, I just wanted
go
to say, I wanted to say one little correction and one question, because we want to keep the discussion open. This is very interesting also for myself. But for the people that eloquently explained the longer term, how much patience do investors need to have with how long term is, and what proof points are there that you deliver versus any other company? Why would you have more confidence in Unilever, who actually has underperformed the decade before? Coming back to the previous question with P&G, not to spend too much time on that, but what the case is referring to is that P&G overtook Unilever in the decade before. At any time since 2009, we actually outperformed P&G. But we started doing that at the beginning already of the implementation of the Sustainable Living Plan. So there are obviously many other factors that play a role. And we're very pleased that P&G made it a little easier on us than they should have done. I agree with that. But the share price performance actually where P&G did better was the decade before, just for the discussion. But the question is, even if you're a long-term investor, what is long-term and what proof points do you need? Can you get away with being a CEO and saying, trust me, I do the right thing because the consumers want it, Constantina, and they're really asking for it. So don't bother me, come back in 10 years and you'll see I was right. Would that work?
Yeah, the thing is that I was noticing the stock price during the period that we studied from 2010 to 2014. And I noticed that the price almost doubled in this period. I think it's a good period to be patient about the price in general, because when you are investing in a huge company, they are already established their reputation in the market. So you are just trying to be patient and try to be innovative in order to gain more market share. As you already said that before 2009 and then you already outperform your competitors. So only innovation in general could improve your current status. So I think a 5-year period, that if I have invested, for example, in your company, I think 5-year period for me would be okay, because you have high risk. And when you are, risk tolerant and risk averse, I think it depends, the return that you are going to have from your investment. And since you pushed away the hedge funds, I think it is a normal period in general. Hedge fund want really fast returns, high returns in the really short term. So since you were trying to find shareholders other than hedge funds, I think it's a normal period for me. I don't know. Of course, I am talking from the safe place, from the safe side of the history, because I saw what happened in the future. Like if I was in 2010 when the economic crisis happened and the markets collapsed, I don't know if I would be patient for the 5-year, but I don't know.
So Constantina, thank you for that. And just a quick note, there is no safe side of history. History repeats itself, so don't get too comfortable. I think, Paul, one observation that some shareholders may have is they look at your stock price relative to P&G. Absolutely, you crossed over P&G post 2009. But then a troubling sign as you go from 2013 to 2014 is in 2013 you were widening the difference between Unilever and P&G, and in 2014 you begin to see P&G sort of slowly creeping up and catching up, and then that may be a source of some concern to some of the shareholders. But we'll kind of put that on pause for a moment, and let's go to Ali. Ali, I think you wanted to bring something up in this discussion.
Sure. I'm on the shareholder pro sustainability strategy team, and I just wanted to respond to the point that's been made a few times about a concern about consumer behavior, and that we're seeing particularly around greenhouse gas emissions and water usage numbers are going up. And I think, I mean, I would acknowledge that that's true. I would acknowledge that, you know, it's a good thing that Unilever is transparent and tracks these metrics. And I think that we've seen so far, the evidence has borne out that they've been able to sort of tweak different approaches and be experimental. And I think that, you know, we should have some faith in that process. But also, I think that Unilever and sort of the private sector in general is uniquely positioned to tackle this kind of issue. And who else sort of knows better about consumer behavior and who has more expertise in this space. And I think especially some of the newer, as of the past few years, since it's 2014 now, partnership initiatives that are coming up around, you know, the Partner to Win initiative and others, that Unilever is sort of filling in this space and providing expertise around consumer behavior change, and we should and see what that yields.
Okay. Great. So thank you, Ali, and thank you to the team as you have tried to provide some support for Paul's strategy. So it's really important for Unilever to not have stock shareholders exit en masse, because that is going to make it very difficult for Paul to get up and defend his position in front of, certainly in front of his board, but also the other group that Anne alluded to. And as Anne said, there are many reasons to continue with this strategy. And one reason is employees. And you mentioned that employees see a lot of benefit in being a part of an organization that is doing this. So we don't know whether that's true or false. Why don't I turn to Morgan? Morgan, is this true as an employee? Is it something that you would support?
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm representing Team 3 for kind of a challenge to the strategy and from the perspective of suppliers. And so the bottom line is that potential costs for disrupting relationship with suppliers outweigh the benefits. And so this transition has a higher likelihood to be value destroying rather than value creating. And so from there, I'll start out with some impact on. You want me to stop there?
Yeah. I think I got your team mixed up. So let me just kind of pause you there. I will come back to you. I absolutely promise. But I do want to get the employee perspective. And let me ask: is Ben here? Ben, yeah. Do you want to speak for the? From the employee's perspective, how are you guys feeling as you're part of all this? I think we have lost Ben for some unexplained reason. So why don't I ask, is Kaylee here?
We lost our employees. That's not good.
So as employees, we want to be proud of where we work, and we do care about sustainability, but we have some concerns about the breadth of the sustainability initiative and kind of how we're being evaluated. We want to make sure that any sustainability efforts make operational and business sense. And we're concerned that we're being evaluated on such long-term targets that we're almost being set up to fail, and we're getting kind of conflicting messages about what our budget should be versus what our goals are as far as marketing and sustainability. And we think that some of the initiatives have been less than strategic, such as like the low flow shower heads, which we think just kind of goes beyond our responsibility as a company, and is kind of potentially an area where we lost a lot in costs. So I think in general, our primary concerns are that we have these big, huge goals that we're supposed to be reaching, and they're kind of being constantly expanded on, and we're being given new initiatives before we've even completed the first ones, and being evaluated on goals that are kind of intangible in some ways, especially with the consumer behavior goals, and stuff having to do with kind of like scope 3 emissions and water use and things like that. So we would just advocate some restraint and maybe restructuring of. Did I freeze?
Okay, so you're concerned that you're being evaluated, Kaylee, just to kind of summarize, you're being evaluated on the basis of outcomes that are not fully within your control. So you can do a whole bunch of things as part of an organization, but if say at the consumer end, people end up not adopting a new product, or like the shower. There is very little that your team, maybe you are part of a product development team, and this is a failure downstream. It may be a failure at the distribution level, and you feel frustrated by that lack of connectivity between what you're responsible for and the final outcome. Is that an accurate just recap of the larger concern that you have as an employee?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Rebecca, anything you would like to add to this?
Sure. So in addition to what Kaylee mentioned, I think there was some details in the case that suggested that just the macroeconomic environment was slowing down. So we saw that growth in developed countries has basically gone horizontal, and in developing countries, the growth rate is starting to slow as well. And so maybe this just isn't the right time to be making these large long-term investments when we see that the sales horizon looks a little bit murky. And if employees are going to be evaluated on hitting their sales targets and their budget goals, as Kaylee mentioned, in addition to these sustainability initiatives, it seems as though those might be in conflict with one another. And so an employee's role in all of this becomes a little bit more ambiguous.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Kaylee. I'd like to kind of get some employees who would like to stand behind Paul, and not only because they want to keep their jobs, but also because they believe in the strategy that Paul is asking them to be a part of. So, Arpit, what do you think?
So one important aspect I feel for any employee is the fulfillment and the satisfaction that you derive out of the job that you're doing. With Paul coming in and redefining the strategies, connecting it to the earlier, like when the company was founded, those strategies, bringing in those initiatives, that kind of reinvigorates the zeal and motivation of the people. I agree this was not an easy challenge to make, but I think that there was enough support provided to achieve this, and it wasn't kind of like in terms of we can see the collaborative nature as well, wherein the marketing team was actually connected to the sustainability team. So and people reaching out to the heads of these teams to kind of take up initiatives and understand with them like what are the changes that need to be made to achieve this long-term sustainability goals. So overall, I feel that with
so Arpit, if I could just sort of interrupt you there, Arpit, apologize. I just want to make sure that we dig in just a little bit more about this connectivity point that you were making. Is there something from the renewed organizational architecture that Paul had put in place that you felt helped with this connectivity in the different functional areas within the organization?
Oh, definitely. In fact, we'd like to hear more from
if you could give some examples. Yeah.
But there was a lot of reorganization on the structure. Quite a lot of people were replaced in the structural level when Paul came in. So one of the reasons could have been to kind of get in people who can, drive the goal, understand that growth can come with sustainability, and, drive that objective way forward. Apart from that, as I mentioned, the sustainability team was kind of merged with the marketing team. So the marketing efforts were made in a way that the customers, the employees, the shareholders, everyone kind of knew what the organization was running into. So I think that really helped a lot.
Okay. Any reactions, responses to that, either from Rebecca, Kaylee, or somebody else on the team? What you just heard from Arpit?
I'll chime in slightly with just a slight comment around combining the marketing team with sustainability team. From one perspective, and I know in the case it talked about sustainability really being integrated comprehensively throughout Unilever's business model, but combining it with the marketing team might actually give the impression that it's more of like a media relations or a PR effort, just based on where it sits functionally within the organization. So that may actually demotivate employees because it might give them the sense that the efforts don't have a lot of integrity. I know the case talks a lot about how they really do, but in some other organizations where sustainability sits within marketing, I think you could make a sort of greenwashing case for it.
So Arpit, any response to Rebecca's critique here, or is somebody from your team likely to come up with a response here?
Yeah, just a small comment on, so I agree on the PR aspect, but I would say that marketing also would involve many things apart from just PR. I mean, in terms of budgeting, in terms of what needs to be portrayed, I mean, they work very closely with, say, all of these individual teams, and it would have been like a larger gamut and not just the PR initiative. That's what I presume.
Okay. All right. Let's take this outside this particular bilateral discussion, and Naman has a comment. Naman, what's going on?
I think I absolutely agree with what Arpit mentioned. The initiatives which Paul took ends up creating a fantastic story for Unilever. And at the end of the day, this would motivate the employees to be a part of something which is much more than the financial bottom lines.
Okay, all right. So thank you for that. Looks like we have some disquiet among the employees, but it also seems like the way the organization has been restructured, which of course is also disquieting because no one likes change. But then after the dust settles, we might see an argument for the employees actually being a little bit more aligned all the way from R&D to marketing and sales and all the functions in between, together with a stitching together of leadership from the CEO's office to the other kind of major functional areas. Why don't we actually now go outside the organization, which is another very critical link in this whole USLP chain, and specifically go upstream, up the supply chain, and ask the question, how are suppliers expected to play a role here? And now, Morgan, you have a chance to gripe about Paul's strategy, because this is definitely having an impact on you guys as suppliers to Unilever.
Awesome, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So we think that the potential for the costs of disrupting the relationship with suppliers would outweigh the benefits. And so the transition would lead to a higher likelihood of value destruction than value creation. And so the impact from implementing this new strategy would revolve around two interrelated themes of impact on operations and impact on finances. And so from the impact on operations perspective, there's a concern about the PR or social image. And since the company is an old company and well-established, that most likely has very strong relationships and ties with its suppliers. And so the benefits of these relationships shouldn't be overlooked. And the downside from severing these relationships could be very detrimental to the company's image. And so then this would lead to potentially a product liability concern, because potentially as you transition to a different supplier, maybe your product will, your quality will decline. And then moving to an impact on finances, one of the biggest things that suppliers represent is obviously they are a valuable source of input, but also a valuable source of financing for the firm, because you can benefit from the favorable accounts payable terms from a long-standing relationship. And then also potentially there's actual input costs from a rise of using different sources. And then that also exposes you to further risk if a company is not transitioning to this type of new strategy. Potentially they have lower costs with their suppliers. And so kind of the interplay of all these different concerns, we thought would be like a cumulative potential negative outcomes outweigh the benefits. And then we also thought about the fact is it says that suppliers only account for 21% of emissions for the whole company, whereas the majority of it's coming from the consumers. And so the potential negative effects of there wouldn't be worth, and we should probably, if we were going to go to this strategy, you would want to concentrate on the consumers.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Morgan. And what say you among the suppliers who actually want to go along with the Unilever strategy? What are your feelings about this? Do you feel that you are willingly complying with the USLP, or you are somehow feeling pressured because Unilever is a big buyer? Oishi, what do you think?
I think definitely it would be unfeasible to say that we don't have the commitment, like we wouldn't benefit from the long-term relationship with Unilever as suppliers. But at the same time, it's a global transformation that is happening, and it's not just an aimless transformation that's happening. It's a very well-informed strategic one. For example, Unilever has already figured out a measurable way to impact the business, results through this transformation. So, and the organization is very open. So the suppliers are also, it's not top down, it's also bottom up. So suppliers are included in the discussion. They are consulted about the progress, about the pace, about the different ways of innovation, and it does benefit the suppliers as well, which is why Unilever was able to sustainably source 85% from their suppliers. So it did resulted in reduction in not just energy usage, but also water usage, and it contributed towards innovation for the suppliers, including use of drip irrigation to reduce water usage, which also resulted in better efficiency of production and presumably at a reduced cost because of less water use. And also, as we've seen in the example of the Knorr soup, we've seen that how 84% of sourcing was possible, like starting from one brand that we have in terms of evidence. But we can also see how the organization also benefited its supplier in different ways. In the case of Vietnam in 2013, when Oxfam requested the inspection, the organization showed openness, and which resulted in the identification of labor practices that were, although Unilever was paying higher than the labor, the minimum wage in Vietnam, but still it was below the international poverty level. So it did result in Unilever, strategizing their production policies there, which has benefited. Also, I think not just only from water and energy, but also by improving access for 800,000 smallholder farmers, and also for gaining more, for allowing more women to have access to training. So these are practices that do benefit the suppliers. And when Unilever is coming in as a strategic partner, not just telling you what to do, but going along with you, growing with you, that does provide you with an insurance that even if it might cause momentary, shake-ups within your business process, but in the long run, it does benefit. And
I have my group mates here, Eva, Danielle, Mrinal. Feel free to jump in.
Eva, Danielle, Mrinal, what do you guys think? You want to add something to Oishi's point?
The one thing I would add is the Unilever's process is so thorough that it's almost providing a type of certification to the supplier. You know, there's an assessment, evaluation, training, this entire process that would typically be very difficult for a supplier to implement on their own. And also that would increase the supplier's ability to maintain contracts with Unilever, potentially other companies, and Unilever's brand is very well known, and the strategy is very well marketed. And so the association with Unilever and complying with that, the supplier complying with that strategy is very advantageous for the supplier's business.
Okay, great. Morgan, I'll give you a minute to react based on what you heard, if you had anything more to add here.
I don't have much more to add. I would probably just say that I think it's always easy from like a different perspective to say if Unilever has this model, they have all these different proven ways in which they've changed. But at the same time, though, for all these different businesses and that suppliers, that the business is using as their suppliers, they have their own business practices and they can't switch overnight. And so there are inherent costs along the entire supply chain that I think will be challenges, essentially.
So I think part of what one needs to see here is if you are in the supply chain for Unilever, and of course Unilever operates with many supply chains, covering an enormous range of products, and different suppliers have different considerations and different constraints and different abilities to change their processes in response to the USLP that is that's being pushed upstream. And for some of them, you can actually see the benefits flowing, as Oishi mentioned, which is you do implement USLP and you begin to see your own resource costs go down, and so your business interests are aligned with what Paul and his colleagues are trying to push upstream. Why don't we take a pause here in terms of our discussion of suppliers and switch gears once again and go to a different stakeholder. And this was alluded to in a point that the shareholders made, which is that they saw some value in the partnership approaches that Unilever was adopting in order to execute on the USLP plan. And an important element of partnership is with the social sector, with the NGO. Now, as an NGO, you're kind of caught betwixt and between a gigantic multinational and a community that you know well and perhaps have strong relationships with. And it's possible that this works relative to the relationship you built, and it's possible that it does not. And as an NGO, how are you feeling about being kind of brought into, potentially co-opted into this larger plan by a gigantic multinational? Drishti, what do you think?
Hi, so yeah, so what I've really been thinking is that, this could potentially be a partnership of convenience. So if a brand fits into the portfolio and, what Unilever wants, then well and good, but they're not. So for instance, if we consider two brands like Knorr versus Fair and Lovely, so to speak, Fair and Lovely was a brand in India. Now, for Knorr, we can see how the benefits are being reached to the bottom of the pyramid at the grassroots level when we're looking at farmers. But in terms of Fair and Lovely, if I was an advocacy organization, for instance, some brands, you'll always have those brands in your portfolio that promote, let's say, racism and other ideals. And that's something that'll always be concerning. And I think it was mentioned in the case, the example of Axe as well.
So just to be fair, Fair and Lovely, it may have been off message in terms of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. I guess my follow-up question to you, Drishti, and the team is as far as the sustainability strategy is concerned, why are you concerned? Why does this pose a problem for you guys?
So it isn't really clear how it would reach the end beneficiary or people actually at the grassroots level. So while it could have a positive impact on, let's say, supply chain suppliers, and, just improving consumer habits and livelihoods and healthcare in general, it still doesn't, it's not clear how it kind of funnels into the deepest parts of the population.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we have some arguments from the NGO community here, and perhaps there are some NGO members that are feeling a lot better about participating in this plan with Unilever. Stella, can you help make a case for why you would go along with Paul and his colleagues on this mission?
Yes. So something that I and I spoke with my group about was a phrase from a previous case saying, "Don't let being perfect be the enemy of doing good." And so, as NGOs, it might seem kind of contrary to partner with a company as such, but because we're seeing that Unilever wants to introduce this program and successfully promote sustainability, I think it wouldn't make sense to not try to partner with them and use this opportunity to promote sustainability. A lot of the problem that I saw, or that was presented in the case with Unilever's program, came from the consumer side. And as we know, NGOs aim to change and affect consumer behavior. So working together, I believe, could address that 70% water waste that is accounted for by consumers, or that increase in greenhouse gases that
Stella, just to make sure that we are on the same page, where are you drawing that data from, that the majority of the problems are coming from the consumer end?
Sorry, let me find it in the case. Let's see. Okay, so on page 3, second to last paragraph, it says suppliers contributed 21% and consumers of its products accounted for 70%.
Okay.
Sure. So I believe that working with NGOs and Unilever together, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. We could work to increase shared value and actually be able to affect the most sustainable change.
Okay. All right. So let's wrap this all together. We have heard from a number of different important stakeholders. And of course, we haven't actually heard from the consumers, who apparently are the source of the problem, according to Stella. But let's keep them aside for now. And we've heard the arguments for and against. And I'm just sending around a poll. And you have 3 choices. Choice 1, in terms of recommendation to Paul, yes, double down on USLP. Forget about all these doubters and the people who are skeptics. This is the time to lean in and just do it. Second option is no, stop it. Respond to the near-term commercial pressures, and you have to, get this ship righted. Otherwise, you will not get the cushion that you need in order to, make these long-term investments. And the third is maybe people have a completely different direction that they want the company to go. So I'm just going to launch this poll, and please pick one of the 3. You have no other choice. Okay, the clock is running down, and you have to think on your feet if you're standing, or think on your chair if you're sitting, but you got to think fast. The poll.
I'm not seeing the poll.
You're not seeing the poll. That is very odd. Well, let's just do it the old-fashioned way, because the poll, according to my end, is saying yes. So let's do it the old-fashioned way, which is we'll do a round of applause. So unmute yourself and applause one, because I'm not going to be able to count the number of blue hands. So applause one. Yes, double down. Keep doing USLP. Okay, I heard a few sounds. All right, okay. No, focus on the near-term commercial objectives and try and right the ship. Okay, option number 3, none of the above, a third direction. Okay, I can see Drishti clapping, but there's no sound. So if you clap in a forest, no one hears you. So Paul, looks like you've got approval from the board to keep doing what you're doing, just based on the clap election here. But let me turn the floor over to you. You heard a whole bunch of arguments for and against you, and what say you?
Well, the first thing I want to say, and I'll come back to that I actually enjoyed the debate and enjoyed listening. And actually it takes a little bit of discipline, because having been so closely associated with the company, you have this urge to jump in and participate. But I felt that you knew it better than I did, and I relived a lot of things. And I want to thank you for that, because you really dived into it and prepared for it. I don't want to keep you all as friends for the sake of keeping you as friends, but this is a very complex issue, obviously. There is no right or wrong, to be honest. And many of these things are not as black and white as it sometimes makes it out. You take shareholders, for example. You know, there are shareholders that genuinely have a function in investing short term, and believe that they have a function in the market to provide liquidity, for example. And those shareholders will have different objectives than the longer term shareholders. And even the longer term shareholders might have different objectives in how they want you to run the business, because they might have different shareholders, again, with different expectations. Some depend on the dividends, others want you to grow and have a low dividend payout. So others might want you to unlock value by splitting up your businesses and running them separately. So it's very difficult to run your business according to the wishes of the shareholders, because a company like Unilever actually had a few million shareholders. And if you take the big shareholders alone, you'd still be talking about 100,000 shareholders when a company has 135 billion market cap. The reality is the market cap of the company turns over nowadays, including because of the day trading and everything, in about 5 months. You know, if you go back 25 years ago, shareholders were really owners of these companies. They would be interested, they'd actually show up in your shareholder meetings. Now the difference between the owners and asset managers or speculators or day traders has made it that the real shareholders are actually too far removed. And the laws might not have fully adjusted to who they are and to whom you should listen. So I've always had the strategy, because the average tenure of a CEO is pretty short. It's about 5 years now, less than 5 years. Having been 10 years CEO was an exception. I could see my colleagues falling down like little pieces of domino stones. And in fact, from the Fortune 500 companies, it's 4.5 years is now the average tenure of a CEO. So most of these CEOs, because they're heavily incentivized with their compensation and under the ban of their shareholder base, will be very reactive to the shareholder base, and especially to the ones that make the most noise, which might be the activist investors that have a 1.5 or 2 share in the company. Most of the other investors are silent because they've become index funds. So you get a really lopsided view of your investor base. And the companies that react to these short-term investors, often incentivized also by a board that seems to be still predominantly shorter term, focused on the share price and compensation of the CEOs, often run their companies for the wrong reason. You cannot run your companies long-term successfully by always maximizing shareholder return. Because if you only focus on one of your stakeholders, which I would argue is the result of what you're doing, it's not even a stakeholder at par with the other ones. But if you would always run it with the shareholder primacy, you're actually running your company into the ground, because you're taking away its reasons for being to the wider society that has to ultimately accept it for being around. The shareholders are not buying your products in the end, it's the citizens of this world. What you now see is the airlines in the last 10 years, 95% of the free cash flow of airlines was spent on special dividends and share buybacks, propping up the share prices of the airlines. Now you get a crisis, the corona crisis, people don't fly, they're all rushing to governments to get 50 billion or more in aid because they can't keep their companies running. That's not responsible. If you want to be around for the long term, you also have to have a strategy for the long term, which also means that you have to help create a world that we can live in for the long term. Most of the investors actually are pension funds. And they are people like yourselves or myself who might retire in 20, 25, 30 years. So they have to take a long-term perspective. Then you come to the fiduciary duties. There isn't really any jurisdiction that actually says that the fiduciary duty is to the shareholder. Most of the laws that are written, including in the US, in Europe, in many other places in the world, is actually that the board has oversight to ensure the longer-term viability of a company, to ensure that the company operates within laws, that the succession planning is there, that the strategy, but all of it points to the longer term. They need to ensure that these companies stay viable concerns and doing that in a responsible way. Nowhere says the law that your sole return as a board is to maximize shareholder wealth, because what does maximizing mean? Maximizing over what period? Maximizing with what? So I've always taken the philosophy that, and it's not right or wrong here, but if you're a short-term shareholder, you don't like me because my strategy doesn't fit yours. And that's why I said in the beginning, hey, we're going to run this company for the longer term. We're going to deliver every year, but we're going to run it for the multiple stakeholders that we serve. And by doing that well, our shareholders will benefit. If we don't do that well, our shareholders will not benefit, and they have the rights to ultimately vote me out or actually put their money somewhere else. Unilever is only a very small part of the global capital markets. So I actually disinvited shareholders because that was my easiest way to start attracting the right shareholder base. Over the 10 years where we focused enormously on attracting the right shareholders, we saw the rotation in our shares go down. In fact, in our company, 70% of our shareholders were holding our shares for 5 years or more, which is exceptional. We also saw that the rotation in the top 10 shareholders was halved over the 10-year period, which is exceptional, which says to me that we were able to attract the shareholders that were more aligned with these longer-term multi-stakeholder strategies. And by the way, it served them well because the return over the 10 years, now with the benefit of hindsight, turned out to be 300%. In fact, at the time of the case study, it was 135%, which is pretty good. In the 4 years after, it actually went to 290, I said 300%. But anyway, on the shareholders, I would say, be very careful what are asset owners, asset managers, what their roles are, what are real shareholders. Now, it was true that when we started with the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which was a bold plan and it was very ambitious, and we've learned a lot of things. There were things I would do differently today with the benefit of hindsight. And as the world changes all the time, it also has to be a plan that has to be flexible. We were accused of setting these targets. At the beginning, it was 50 targets. And people said to me, but what if you don't achieve the 50? Are you going to get fired if you miss some? Or people would say to me, but you're not there in 10 years anyway. So it's nice for you to make these targets. but you will never be held accountable, so they're useless. Well, it turned out I was there for 10 years, and it also actually turned out that many of these targets changed over the 10 years. And the reason that they changed was because these targets for me were not like ingrained in stone or engraved in stone to be fixed, because I knew damn well that the world was going to change significantly over these 10 years. And boy, did that turn out to be true. If I learned one lesson myself, if I look back over the 10 years, I might have been a little bit ahead of the rest of the industry in what we thought was needed. But if I look back over the 10 years, I regret I wasn't more aggressive, because clearly what you see now is a good example of, you know, boy, are we in trouble? Are we slow to react to things like climate change, planetary boundaries, inequality? We have not been able to address that at the speed that I thought it was coming. So I actually regret we weren't aggressive enough. But the plan for me was a philosophy. The plan for me was a philosophy to run a business with multiple stakeholders into account, to run a business for the longer term, and to put at its core of the business the sustainable development goals, i.e. to show that you as a business model can have a positive contribution to society, not less bad, like CSR is basically less bad, or actually having a contribution that doesn't make any sense. So if you cannot show over time as a company, as a minimum, that you have no negative impact on this world, but I would argue, because we have already passed some of these planetary boundaries, if you cannot show that you are actually an organization that helps improve the state of the world, you have quite lower chances of being around long term. I think that is one of the reasons why you see the number of publicly traded companies in the last 70 years going down, not only in its length that it exists. A company when I was born in 1956 used to exist on average for 67 years. That has dropped down now to below 17 years. But you also see the number of publicly traded companies has come down drastically because of this myopic focus on the shareholders. We used to have about 8,000 companies publicly traded in the US. It's now 4,000. And sure, there are many reasons for it. But isn't it sad that only now these 4,000 companies are publicly traded for the society to benefit from their wealth creation? Shouldn't it be more and having a broader wealth creation? So the role of the shareholders and how you approach your shareholders depends obviously on your business philosophy, your business model. If it's a longer term model or a shorter term model. Undoubtedly the oil companies that invest now for a 20-year for a decision today that only starts to pay out in 20 years, when you talk exploration or something, has a different shareholder base than a consumer goods company, which is a more dynamic market, and actually might have a different shareholder base than a company that is in IT, that produces but might be obsolete in 1 or 2 years because of a cycle that is much faster. So my message is very simple, is there is no right or wrong here, but attract the right shareholder base. Now, what is missing with the shareholders, and I think Sujya made the point very clear, was that how can the shareholders trust you if you don't have proof? The shareholders have to invest in many companies, and they cannot really compare what one company says versus another. You know, someone made the point on greenwashing, or, you know, you say this is important, but is it really? Unfortunately, what has happened is 30, 40 years ago, 85% of the value of a company was explained by tangible assets. And that's our accounting system even today still. And we could more or less assess what the value of a company was, and that is what investors were doing. Today, it's only 15%. The rest we call intangibles or goodwill that we cannot measure. But we can. But it's unfortunately we haven't done it. We've been lazy. But we can measure culture. We can measure the value of a portfolio in terms of its robustness. We can measure risk. We can measure employee motivation. So there are many things actually that we can measure now. But the investor community was relatively slow, not for its own doing, but because a lot of the CEOs were not able to explain it to them. And that's why the investment community said, how can I convince you? Or how can you convince me that this is the right thing to do? So I understand some of these investors. But attracting the right investors is one of the most important things, and being able to make your story work. Now, there is one assumption that you guys have made a little bit too often that I don't necessarily subscribe to. There is this thinking that has crept into our Socrates way of learning versus the Confucian way of learning, that if something is right, there either must be something to it or the cost must be higher. So this trade-off that we have crept into our minds of doing the right thing must be more expensive, who's going to pay for it, is actually proven wrong now more and more. And the longer we wait to address these burning issues of climate change, of food security, of poverty, I would argue we're actually incurring significantly higher cost by not addressing the issues than if we would address them. I've actually greened the total Unilever value chain as we talk, but I've never had to make a decision with a payout of longer than 3 years. In fact, most of my payouts were less than 1 to 2 years. And many companies were willing to invest the capital for us by giving us lower energy rates and pocketing the difference themselves by being specialized in that field. There was no compromise. Now, in some areas of the business, you have compromises, but don't we in every area? Ask yourself the question, when you invest in training and development of your employees, how long does it really take before that pays up? Why do you do it? If you invest in IT systems for a company, how long will it sometimes take to pay out? Admittedly, shorter and shorter, I recognize that. But you're taking a decision now for a later payout. A factory, you're putting a factory down. Even in the case of Unilever, we had 572 factories. I was building at every time about 22 factories. On average, they only start paying out 5 years later. It's not because you build a factory that all of a sudden all the lines are full. It doesn't work that way. But why do you do it? Because it's the right investment to guarantee the longer term value of your business. You go into a country like China, it might take you 10, 15 years before you get a return on your investments. So why are we willing to do those things to keep our businesses going? And why aren't we willing to invest in the future of humanity? Why aren't we willing to invest in some of the conditions that are needed to make our businesses flourish? Businesses cannot succeed in societies that fail, nor can businesses succeed in environments where we exceed the planetary boundaries. It's as simple as that. So I don't see it differently from the other investments. And actually, one stakeholder group that was missing from this discussion, which would have been interesting if it was there, would be the planet itself. Would be the planet itself. And that is a very important one, actually, as we discover increasingly more. So I agree with the shareholder debate, which is actually a very tricky one, but I also am optimistic because I increasingly think that the shareholders see the financial opportunities now of investing in companies that have lower risk, that are better positioned for the future, and that actually are better in sync with society. We can now measure employee engagement very quickly. We can measure if you are an employer brand. It took a while for me to explain to the investor community that our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan became the source of attraction of people across the world to work for us. Actually, to the extent which surprised us, that we were the third most looked up company, as you saw in the case study, after Google and Apple on LinkedIn. And we are not a brand name. Unilever is not like Google or Apple. We only hired about 8,000 employees, but I can assure you that in every country we became the #1 employer, and we could hire the best and brightest people. That to me was actually the most important indicator for ensuring that we had a bright future. But for the investor community, it was hard to understand in the beginning when you don't see that correlation right away, and when you don't see these as the key materiality of all these drivers towards the results. Think about employee engagement. Because of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, we saw the engagement go up from the lower tercile when I joined the company to the top of the upper tercile. We saw the company risk go down significantly. A company like GlobeScan put us twice as high in corporate reputation, even than companies like Patagonia. But unfortunately, we did a lousy job, myself included, to explain that very well in the beginning, to the financial community because there simply wasn't much data and we were out there alone. Now there's an important lesson in leadership which came up at the beginning. Yes, if you are the first one, you expose yourselves, but someone has to be the first one to make these changes. When I said we're going to run the business for the longer term because we cannot address all these issues with the myopic focus on the quarters, I made the decision to abolish quarterly reporting, to abolish guidance. The share price went down 8%, but I hadn't changed anything in the company. It went down 8% because of a lack of trust, of a lack of understanding, because the fundamentals hadn't changed. In fact, I had strengthened the fundamentals by letting the company run the business in a way that would be much better longer term to grow it, and not to manipulate brand spending or costs or other things that would be dysfunctional. 75% of the CFOs in the US, of the major companies, make the wrong decision of investments in the quarters if it affects the guidance that they had given for the quarter. In fact, they are putting a company at risk. That's very dangerous. So as a leader, you have to go out of that and make some of these things overt, transparent, if you want to drive that change in the markets that is needed. Now, so more facts about sustainability was one of the things that we were late at, and better explaining it to our investor community was one of the things I should have done earlier. I was a little bit convinced myself too much that I assumed it was so obvious for other people. We're a little bit further now. We have a little bit more data. It's a little bit more proof that purpose-driven companies are doing better, that companies that have ESG do better, companies that take climate and have a price on carbon, disclose, are doing better. I think it's easier to make the case now. Society needs it better. The way I tried to establish trust was in fact by putting out initially 50 targets for the USLP. I got attacked on that, too many. My board wasn't happy. Are you micromanaging the business? But my point was trust is so low. And unfortunately, trust has gone lower over the 10 years that I was CEO, not for Unilever, but for corporate America or other institutions. And you cannot build any partnerships if you don't have trust. And one of the things I saw was the objectives that we set, where we first had to get our own house in order, then started working in the value chain, which is sort of where the case is, and then working on the more transformative changes, that the only way to do that successfully is by build trust. And putting these targets out there, having that audited, took the issue of greenwashing away. It actually had a lot of credibility and a lot of support from the NGO community. So that's why we did the 50 targets. And it actually also became easy to change them when issues changed in the world. When the Rana Plaza factory collapsed, when I asked Oxfam to do an audit of our value chain in probably one of the toughest markets like Vietnam, we saw that we had probably under prioritized the S, the social aspect of the ESG. So we had to step it up. The case talks about bringing Marcella Manubens in. I was fortunately to find her. She had worked in the fashion industry, which is one of the worst ones for labor standards. So I wanted this torture test in my company, but we lifted up these standards at that time on the USLP, and that was well appreciated. My learning was, I wish I would have done it earlier. I wish I would have done it earlier. By working human rights in your value chain, which we did with John Ruggie, by working rights, skills, and opportunities, by working gender, by putting in livelihoods for smallholder farmers, ensuring that half of them were women, etc. We really made our value chain much more robust. And again, from child labor, from slave labor, from engagement with that value chain to ensure that they work for us. And I think the investor community started to understand that over time, but it wasn't obvious either. I actually had to bring them there to show them. And then it came alive when we had a few visits to countries like Indonesia for our investor days, then it became alive. As far as our partners are concerned, you are right. When you make such a dramatic change, our partners feel unsettled because they don't know what is going to happen and it's not in their control. And frankly, with the size of Unilever, there are always some that feel that you are the bully and they're the little guy on the block. So what can they do? And so you have to be very careful in your own company that you're not complacent, that you are not violating your values, and that you treat all the suppliers with respect. The main ones are obviously your top 100 suppliers, and the Partner to Win was focused on the top 100 suppliers. Although Unilever had 70 to 80,000 suppliers, the top 100 suppliers made up about 60% of that. So that's where we focused on. What we actually found was that we didn't have good supplier relationships when we started, because the company had been going down and was so much focused on cost and financial results. It had given up on a lot of things. It had given up on its own people. It had given up on investing in training. It had given up on the quality of our products. It had given up on investing in factories. We were only closing factories. So the reason I had to do this multi-stakeholder model of our own employees, our factories, our products with the consumers, was because we had to get this company back to growth. So suppliers were actually happy, because surprisingly, we moved away from a focus myopically on cost to a focus on partnership for the longer term, with a model that actually turned out to be very energizing for most of our suppliers. We might have lost a few of the top 100 because, again, it's not all black or white. There's always a few shades of gray in between. But these suppliers were suppliers that were dealing with the Henkels or the P&Gs or the L'Oreals or many others. So I would say don't feel sorry for them. But the suppliers that stayed with us broadly benefited from that. But more importantly, we benefited from the suppliers. But don't only see the suppliers as the top 100. See the suppliers, which is far more important to me. See the suppliers as the millions of people in your value chain that depend on you. See them as the farmers, the smallholder farmers who produce your products. We have 100,000 smallholder farmers just working in the palm oil industry. See the suppliers as in the agricultural work in Africa, on our tea plantations. These are suppliers. And we moved a lot of them from contingent labor to being permanently on the payroll by trying to improve their livelihoods. My goal was, and the reason I was in tea, I like tea, but the reason I was in tea, not to be in tea, I could have been anywhere. But tea is an ideal product to create livelihoods for people. You give them 2 acres and you give them the drought-resistant bushes, some agricultural advice on water and soil management, and the person doesn't have to have their kids work in the field. They can send their kids to school and come out of it. You provide housing and electricity and all the other things. You create livelihoods. And as you create livelihoods, you create economies. And as you create economies, then companies like ours will do well in that. So it's a philosophy of doing business that is a little bit longer term, but I think most of our suppliers felt fairly happy with it. It's only when there is some short-term pressure in these businesses, which sometimes happens, that you compromise. But I think it's far more important with suppliers to work on the innovations together. The combined R&D budget of all of our suppliers was about 100 times bigger than R&D budget of Unilever alone. I'd be stupid. One of the reasons that I went on the board of Dow, where I've been 9 years on the board of Dow Chemical, is to understand our suppliers better, to be able to make that an integral part of Unilever. And I think many of these suppliers, often in meetings, you would not know the difference between us and them in terms of for which companies they worked for. Now, in terms of the social sector, it's a very important thing, because the social sector, rightfully so, needs a lot of the capabilities of the private sector, the products, the resources, the financial. Otherwise, they frankly have a hard time to survive. The money has to come from somewhere, and we've discovered, at least over the 10 years, that it doesn't come from governments, or if anything, that is becoming significantly less. But you have to work with the private sector with the right philosophy. I always felt that making the biggest decisions in Unilever couldn't be my decisions. They had to be decisions where government, civil society, and the private sector needed to be involved. So the decision to build a tea plantation in Rwanda to provide livelihoods to 100,000 people, I wanted the government of the UK to be involved to ensure that human rights were respected, that the land was cleared in the proper way, that people were protected. But I also wanted to ensure that the smallholder farmer, who has always the wrong end of the stick, the moment he picks the leaf, he doesn't have any bargaining power. The moment the farmer milks the cow, he doesn't have any bargaining power, or she. So the farmer always gets the wrong end of the stick. 90% of the poverty in the world, you find that in monocrop farming in the rural areas. So we went with an NGO, with DFID, the UK Development Agency, with an NGO, and we put that in place just to be sure that it was more robust, that we put a holistic plan in place. And the results are always better. Is it a compromise? Short term, perhaps, if you call it that way, but you put out much more robust ecosystems. And what it does is it gains a lot of credibility. Now, most of our NGOs that we picked were NGOs like the World Food Program or Oxfam, UNICEF, and Save the Children. And not surprising if you look at those NGOs, which I am now still helping in my private capacity through this crisis, are NGOs that really fight for the poor. The reason I joined a company like Unilever is that I really want to fight for the people that can't fight for themselves, because they're the ones that are always paying the price for our, to some extent, irresponsible behavior. So Unilever is a philosophy really of, and as you know, in India, working with the poor and trying to lift everybody out of poverty. That is where we are best. That is why we have 60% of the business in the emerging markets, but even more so to reach those markets with things like hand washing, or creating jobs for smallholder farmers, or oral care, which is 50% of the absence in schools, or nutrition. You have to work that in partnerships, and you have to work that with the people that have the biggest needs. I always felt that we are very fortunate to do the jobs that we are doing, to be educated, to go to great institutions like yourselves, to be financially independent, to sort of be able to make our own choices. But frankly, that is not the case for the majority of the people in this world. And with this crisis, we've discovered for even more people than we thought. So if we are so fortunate, then it's our duty to put ourselves to the service of the others. And that happens at an individual level as our purpose in life, wherever we think that is most useful and in line with our values and our capabilities, but it is also at the corporate level. And if we can find that sweet spot of marrying what we're good at with the values that we stand for, and then being able to do that economically viable, we can create that better world for all that we aspire to. The goals that I had were two things: to show that there are alternative business models that could be good, the multi-stakeholder longer-term models. I think we've moved that debate forward. I'm terribly disappointed that it wasn't as fast. I feel I failed a little bit there, and we could have done more. And the second thing I wanted to show is that putting the Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of the business model. That's why I launched the Business and Sustainable Development Commission and work so much with the UN still today, that actually would be a very profitable model. I think, again, increasingly we're showing that, but I'm a little bit disappointed still with the speed that the financial market is catching on in this respect. So to some extent, we've failed there as well. So leadership is about doing the harder rights than the easier wrongs. Leadership is putting yourself to the service of others, knowing that by doing so, you're better off yourselves as well. Leadership is about partnership for the common good. And leadership is intergenerational. We've done more damage in the last 30, 40 years to this planet Earth than in its 4 billion or 3.5, 4 billion years of existence. What the heck gives us the right to do that? It is totally incomprehensible to me. I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to be part of that. People might now see that tragically we have 39 or 38,000 people that have died of the coronavirus, everyone regrettable. But 8 million people die every year of air pollution. I don't want to be part of that. 826 million people go to bed every day in this world of hunger, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. I don't want to be part of that. So many of the other issues need to be addressed if we want to live in a world in harmony and in a world that can function now and for future generations to come. And the companies that understand that will survive. Now here is one step beyond shared value. Sure, a company needs to stay at the right side of the law. That is a given. And frankly, that is where you will find 80, 90% of the companies today. That's already tough enough to struggle. Then some companies make more money than they thought, so they become a little bit philanthropistic. And the philanthropy is fine, but it's nearly driven by a feeling of guilt, and it's not really a solution to long-term address these problems that were created by the way these companies operate in the first place. Then someone became smart and say, hey, we can do a little bit better as a company, so we create cause-related marketing. So then we got that part of it, and that gets you into the next step, which is CSR. All of that is less bad, actually parts only of your company, often only the part that is under your control, and not your value chain. And we said in Unilever, that clearly isn't enough because it doesn't give us the results that we as a world need. So you need to take responsibility of your total footprint, of your total value chain. If you cannot only say my factories. In fact, in carbon, we at that time had reduced our own carbon already by 40 or 45%. I forgot the numbers. But because we had bought other companies like Alberto Culver, because we took responsibility of the total value chain, where consumers shower and cook, and a lot of that heating in the house comes from coal or other things, that was out of our control. But we took responsibility for that. We felt that although you outsource parts of your supply chain, you cannot outsource your responsibility. So the next step of businesses is to take holistic responsibility of your total footprint in the world and try to make that positive. Now, I think there is one step that will be coming to the academic institutions and others after that, which is the real next step after shared value, which is where companies collectively form partnerships to address the bigger societal issues. Not only showing that you can run your own business in a responsible way, but where you are actually part of the bigger global transformations. That's why we created Imagine to do that. And that is why I'm actually pleased to see on the COVID virus, these exceptional partnerships now coming along around the healthcare or finding solutions, around hygiene and shipping products around. Retailers now going together to get the supply chains growing again and getting out of hoarding. We see creativity at the corporate level and at a different level than we've ever seen before. So can we harness that energy, that heightened sense of humanity and collectiveness that comes from us, not from our politicians, unfortunately? Can we harness that now to bend the curve of capitalism and to get to moral or stakeholder capitalism? There will not be one model, there will not be one right model, but at least we all should set an ambition of what we should shoot for to ensure that we put ourselves to the service of everybody on this planet Earth and actually achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which have a very simple objective to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. And the fact that you've been able to discuss this complex case, handle both sides of the equations, understand that it is not a right or a wrong, shows you also that you're great leaders and great leaders to become. Purpose-driven, able to manage these dichotomies. These classes are incredibly useful, and you're very blessed with a great professor as well. So my investment in the 2 hours have been incredibly energizing and also confident that we're creating the right leaders to then obviously design the world we want, the world that functions for everybody and for generations to come. So I want to thank you for that.
Unmute your phones and just.
And we're smack on time.
Right on time, and regardless of whether they clap for continuing USLP or canning it or going in a third direction, I seem to hear almost every hand clapping for the observations and comments and suggestions, and frankly a visionary perspective, Paul. And I was trying to keep pace to even capture what were some of the key points, and I just ran out of paper, and I think it's really important that we at least recap whatever I could capture on the piece of paper that I have. And just to very quickly recap, attract the right shareholders. Your shareholders may walk, but have confidence that you will keep the right ones. intangibles are important, and it is a combination of how you measure risk, how you measure goodwill, even employees or goodwill across your value chain is going to be really important. If you do the right thing, it is not going to be more expensive. It may involve an investment in the near term, but over the longer term, or even in the medium term, it actually ends up being less expensive. And it's less expensive, not just for you as a company, but everybody above and below you in the supply chain. This is a strategy that is lower risk. It's better for your employees, and it is attractive to shareholders. And ultimately, there is a question of leaders, and leaders need to be leaders, as in lead others, and perhaps do things before others are doing it. And sometimes that involves taking risk. And sometimes that involves recognizing that people don't trust you because you are the first one to have done it. So how do you build trust? And how do you actually invest in the data that builds trust? Value chains. Value chains are enormously important. You need to think not just within the organization, but across the value chain. Just thinking about the partners that are part of that value chain, not everybody sees it the same way, and sometimes they feel pressured, and sometimes they kind of see are eye to eye with you. Perhaps it's important to, just like letting some of your shareholders walk, perhaps it's important to also let some of your partners walk, and then focus on the part of the value chain, part of your partners who kind of see eye to eye with you. And that value chain involves not just the big suppliers, but all the smallholder farmers, the small suppliers, who rely on you for their livelihoods, their day-to-day livelihoods. The role of the NGOs are enormously important because they're the connective tissue between where you are in a large corporate setting and the ones who do not have bargaining power. And one does need to identify what are the sweet spots. What are you good at? What are your values? And how do you translate that into a way to sustainably generate resources so that you can continue to do well while you're doing work that aligns with your values. Bringing the sustainable development goals into your business model is an enormously important part of the process. And I can keep going. We are seeing a journey from pure philanthropy to CSR to shared value to actually sharing shared value. We're looking at a network of organizations coming together, and now that sort of brings me to a question which we don't have time for, Paul. And you have been enormously generous, with your time. I could ask you to stay on, but I will not because it is very late for you. But something for all of us to think about is we are at this moment where it is truly a before COVID and after COVID moment. As we come out of this tunnel, which I'm sure we will, how will the world look? And many of the assumptions that we made going in have been turned upside down. We're beginning to see that turning of the upside down process, happening as we speak. But what will happen on the other side? We have entire sectors that have been devastated. We have seen a fiscal stimulus along the lines that we have never seen before in a country that did not believe in a safety net. And we have realized that we have no safety net, certainly in this country and in much of the rest of the world. So how do we rethink those assumptions? What assumptions are going to only get reinforced along the lines of what you were just talking about? And which ones are we going to put aside? And which ones are actually at risk? I mean, many of the things you said, our heads were nodding, but when we come out of the tunnel on the other side, and we see the devastation, we see the stock market, just barely recovering, and they're looking for the airlines to start taking off again. Is the stock market going to come at this question in a very different way? So I think there are lots of questions for us to all think about, and we certainly as a class are going to be thinking about it. We as a school, the Fletcher School, sit at the intersection of all of these issues, and we are going to put our minds to thinking about it. I made this analogy in an earlier discussion on a very similar topic, and I'll make it again. I find physical analogies something that often stick in our minds. And when Napoleon III was rebuilding Paris in the 19th century after the cholera epidemic, he built it with wide boulevards. And part of the reasoning was sunlight. It was believed, takes away some of the germs and the miasma. And now we have the wide boulevards of Paris, which we've either been there or we've not been there, but we all are inspired by it. And my question to all of us gathered around here as a Fletcher community, and certainly to you, Paul, as a leader of corporations around the world, is what is that Paris that we plan to build on the other side? And how do we make sure that those boulevards are wide and not tiny, broken lanes, which in many cases there have been in the past. So I'm deeply grateful to you. Unfortunately, just given the time, I wanted to let you run because you just had more ideas than we can fill in a talk. We didn't have time for questions. So I am deeply thankful to you, to all of our participants, my class that has been here. And we will find another time to actually ask those questions to you. Maybe we can reach you in some form. And if you're open to that, we can find a social media platform or a Zoom platform to do a follow-up.
Yeah. No problem. Send them to me and I'll get to you. I'll get them back to you.
Okay.
And thanks. Thanks, everybody.
So much.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Bedtime here.
Yeah. Thank you. To my class, thank you for sitting still for a long time. And I wanted to also thank everybody who is not from the class and joined us in, as you can see, an incredible journey. Paul, when he was a young man, was training to be a preacher and, decided to not do that and do something else. But you can see that he would have been very good at his original occupation. And I'm sure there's a lot that you have absorbed over the course of the last 2 hours, and both the terrific ideas from around the room, but also the perspective from someone who's actually been there. And in many ways, it's not just Unilever, the organization and the value chain that he's tried to transform. He's trying to do that across the board, across the private sector and the social sector, and frankly, the public sector. What I would like the class to do is let's take 5 minutes, get some blood circulation, do yoga, get a drink of whatever beverage you choose to. And what I would ask you to do is let's just regroup for maybe 20 minutes. I know this has been, I'm sure, a long day after a long day. And for some of you, your day is probably a night or it's just beginning. So let's just take 20, 25 minutes. I just want to regroup on, just do a debrief on what you heard. And also I want to check in on how your projects are going. And just a few words before we disperse and we collect next week to discuss the project. So 5 minutes I have on my clock here, Eastern time, 8:07. Let's come back at, I'm sorry, 6:07 p.m. Let's come back at 6:12 p.m. Eastern time and walk around and do something silly.
Excuse me, Bhaskar, would you like me, it's Maria, would you like me to stop the recording now?
You can keep, actually, yeah, just pause the recording, Maria. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Everyone's okay? So far, so good? Great. Any reflections about the discussions over the last 2 hours, which seemed like it went really fast, but there was a lot that we packed in. Yeah, Mrinal, and let's use blue hands, but Mrinal, go ahead.
Yeah. I think, Professor, thank you for such an opportunity to listen to Paul, because we had some very valuable insights. I think it was outstanding to hear him talk about the shareholder perspective of things, the shareholder value, about leadership, how to build trust. These are things that are so difficult to implement and to stand by while you're really at the hem of affairs, and that too in distress times. So I think one of the finest examples of learning the right attitude while doing business in these times specifically.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oishi?
I think Professor Mrinal said a lot, shared a lot of what I felt too. I think definitely one of the best Fletcher classes, if not the best. And it was incredible to hear. I was honestly surprised when he said that he should have been more aggressive with what he did, like he was micromanaging. There was a lot written about his management style. He was criticized also at that time, and I heard his speeches in the SDG forum and a few places where he spoke, where he seemed a lot more, I think, softer than he seemed today in class. And I was honestly, while reading the case, wondering how he did that. And the case was very positive. The case seemed like it didn't, I felt that it didn't show the real challenges that much. It seemed like they had evidence business was working. So I actually wanted to ask him questions about like what were the like real struggles, but he covered a lot. And it was incredible to know how now he has like kind of set the ground for an industry, not just his company, and he has done it from such a what can I say, superficially leadership position, like so high above and yet driving thing. Unlike we also learned about Indira Nui in one of our classes. So it seemed they were trying to do similar things in different times, but such different journeys. It was really incredible to know about it. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Oishi. And of course, as you can appreciate, writing a case study about a company and then getting the company's approval requires taking out a few things that may be challenging to get the final approval. So we always rely on our critical thinking skills to read between the lines in terms of anticipating what some of the difficulties might have been. And several of you in your critiques, kind of went there, which I think I really appreciate. And I know that I put you all on the spot with Paul right there. But this is the moment to do it before you get in front of your next CEO. And if you have survived criticizing this individual, then you'll certainly do well trying to challenge your next organization and taking a truly critical look at what they're doing. In terms of some of the challenges regarding the external shareholders and the shareholder and the market, Paul did face, and he didn't touch on that in his observations. He did face a lot of pushback towards the last few years of his run as CEO. Specifically, a private equity firm basically made a play for Unilever, and it was close to acquiring Unilever, a hostile takeover. And what I will say is it was stunning that the board, the Unilever board, stood by Paul and rejected the takeover from the private equity firm, which is very difficult to see. It's very difficult to push back that kind of an attractive offer from the outside, an aggressive offer from the outside. So the board stood by Paul because of everything else that he was talking about. All those points he made was what made the board stand by him. And of course, it was also clear that he was going to then live with a lot of challenges once the board gave him room to run. And it was time for him to basically say, okay, I've done this for one company. Now I'm going to try and bring multiple companies together underneath an umbrella, and which is what he is doing now. Nate?
I think one of the things he talked about that I thought was interesting, that was in the case a little bit, was how, like, while there are a wide variety of stakeholders, His perspective was that the shareholders are not necessarily the most important one, because they're sort of a function of how well the company is actually doing. And if you treat your employees right and your supply chain right, and you're giving the customers what they want, then the shareholders will follow.
Yeah.
So I liked hearing that directly from him.
Yeah, and that is a very, very important point, of course, to keep in mind as you reflect on last year's commitment from the CEOs, part of the Business Roundtable, to commit to serving stakeholders versus shareholders. Now, it's easier to sign on a piece of paper than to actually do it. And Paul is one of those rare CEOs who's actually done it. And he's got plenty of battle scars to show for it. For most CEOs, the problem is that the shareholders are not going to give them the time, And that's because every quarter they have to go up in front of analysts as publicly traded companies and explain why they have not met earnings expectations. And if you are not given a long enough leash, then you can't run far enough. And if you can't run far enough, you cannot get that ball or pick up that bone and bring it back. And what happens is either there is a takeover initiative from the outside, or the CEO gets fired. And that fear keeps the CEOs from going back and saying, okay, I actually do need to work across multiple stakeholders. Another factor, and this is not an unimportant one, which is a real one to consider from a critical thinking perspective, which is shareholder performance is not easy, but easier to capture, because most of it is in the financials. When one thinks about other stakeholders, it's much harder because many of the performance measures there are intangible, or they're dispersed across multiple parts of the environment. And so of course we try to do measurement and evaluation and impact evaluation, but it's still a rough and ready process. It's still a noisy process. There isn't enough consistency. There aren't enough sort of reliable forms of reporting. Whereas the market is the market. The market basically kind of says, okay, this is the amount of money you made last quarter, and here is my response in terms of stock price performance. So that is the other point of tension, where a lot of thoughtful people who will say, yes, a CEO should be serving multiple stakeholders. However, a poor performing CEO may take cover underneath poor performance and say, well, I'm actually performing poorly as far as my financials are concerned, because I'm trying to serve all these other stakeholder bodies. And you could hide poor performance underneath that. And that is a real issue. So you, as critical thinkers, as analysts, and as future leaders of organizations, need to be able to distinguish between those who are trying to take cover for poor performance and those who are truly trying to actually perform on multiple fronts. Nicole.
Yes, so I was hoping to ask a question specifically to Paul in regards to the part in the case where it talks about how he set up I guess a sort of sub-team to measure the impact and the business impact of these things. I assume in order to then show results, since he's not doing the quarterly, but to give good, like, quantifiable numbers in which you can give to shareholders or whoever is looking. I was hoping to hear more about that process that he had gone through for that.
Yeah, and a great point, Nicole. And if you go to Exhibit 8, you can see the outcomes of some of that, basically from this. Yeah, so some of this, the Compass framework is being populated by many of those measures. Again, there's some tension here in the following sense. Once you commit to doing these kinds of measurements and you publish them, then it's not just the Wall Street analysts that are going to come after you. Every single advocacy group that cares about each one of those points is going to come after you. And that can become very, very difficult to manage, because they're going to start asking questions. Why did you not perform on these measures? And why did you, overperform on that other measure? I care about water. Why, what is this about packaging? And that can be an endless cycle. So that's one issue. Another issue is, quite often, say for instance, let's take the example of packaging, reducing plastics and packaging. This is something that you can actually measure quite reliably, because it's a physical product, and you can identify how much plastics have been used across your supply chain and within your company. However, say as part of your corporate growth, you need to go into the developing world, which is where the growth is. And as part of that process, you acquire a developing world company. Okay, and Unilever, like many multinationals, have done that in order to expand into new markets. Now, the moment you acquire a new company from the developing world, their use of packaging and plastics is much higher than yours. So what it does is it completely throws you off the goals that you had set for bringing down your packaging, right? So now there's a tension. Do I go into the developing world and serve, these consumers who want Lifebuoy soap, who want the shampoo, who want the cleaning products, or not? And the only way to do it is by diluting my performance measure. So, absolutely, I think this is such an important point, but it's also a point that needs to be seen in the larger context of maintaining profitable growth, so that you can continue to generate the resources to do sustainable development. Marie.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Marie, go ahead. We need to unmute you, and let's try that. Unmute, okay.
Okay. I felt that a lot of what had happened at Unilever was really driven by his leadership, which is something that we found in the cases at the beginning of the semester, and something I thought was really important to bring up. I think that he not only was able to acknowledge the challenges to his kind of reformation of the company, but was really consistent in continuing to be innovative, but also like understanding where they had grown, but saying that that wasn't enough. And I wonder if it had been another CEO, would it have been as successful, or would they have kind of wavered in their kind of ambitions if they were getting pushback from shareholders or stakeholders, or their profits were going down in response to all the funding that they were directing towards the projects themselves?
Do you have an answer to your question?
Well, I think that particularly in our class, we learned that the person is really central to kind of the success of a company. And so part of me feels that no, we have seen that leadership is really core to kind of making a program more successful.
Yeah, so leadership is core, and at the same time, what I would say to you is leadership is learnable, and that's why all of you are here. You can also see that in addition to having the managerial capabilities, you also need to be able to communicate your vision. You got to be able to communicate those ideas. And in that last half hour, you could see why he could command, the attention of so many different disparate stakeholders, many of whom actually did not agree with him, and many of whom did not agree with each other. And it's really important to be able to strike a balance among these disparate objectives, the disparate incentives, which is absolutely essential to be able to strike that balance and yet not dilute your overall objectives. And ultimately, that is what leadership is about. At least one of the key things of leadership. And
yes, so I have one quick question. I thought it was interesting. I think you also mentioned from the start that he, or maybe it was Nathaniel, about how important it was like aligning with the interests of the shareholders and also how long they were staying on. And even for CEOs he was CEO for 10 years, and those that the duration of time that CEOs have been on also impacts their leadership and what their vision for the company. And I was curious, did he was he contracted to be CEO for 10 years from the start, or how does that actually work? Yeah.
No, I obviously haven't seen his employment contract. But contracted, no CEO is contracted for 10 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So he was brought in to turn around the company at a time when the company was not doing well, and at a time when the global economy was on its knees.
Right. Yeah.
So he had a steep hill to climb. So he was given a long leash. He was given a long leash, recognizing that there were two turnarounds: an internal turnaround and an external environmental turnaround. He took advantage of that long leash. So nobody said, "You will be around for 10 years, guaranteed. Don't worry, we'll check in after 10 years." It certainly gave him enough time, and he said, "Okay, this is it. This is what I've been wanting to do all my life, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to use this opportunity." And that's exactly the point of not letting a crisis go to waste. And he basically turned the entire company strategy and the strategies of all the supply chains and the downstream players like the NGOs upside down. And he has a business that operates hundreds and hundreds of products across 192 and counting countries.
Right.
When he was at Fletcher a couple of years back, I asked him, "So which countries have you left out?" And he said, he was trying to remember, and he said Iran and North Korea. Other than that, they're everywhere. So, so he also has time to recover from a crisis, and then try to implement this in a very, very complex business. This is not like Facebook, which has a very large number of users, 2.5 billion plus another 2 billion on a couple of other platforms. But Facebook has a relatively small product line, and it's easier to manipulate the supply chains and the products of Facebook because it's very streamlined.
Yeah.
So the other thing that helped Paul is he is based in Europe. So it's an Anglo-Dutch company.
Right.
And I say the combination of the Dutch heritage and the British heritage helps because, and this kind of goes into a larger theory that I have, which is that history matters. And many of these countries in Europe, they have a longer history of dealing with the complexities that are there in the world. And if a company like Unilever starts with the assumption that my growth is going to come from the developing world, these are countries, both the UK and the Netherlands, they've been colonial powers. They invented the original notion of a multinational corporation through their respective East India companies. And so they were also patient in terms of a management team and a board and an oversight team. So that really helped. If he were an American company, he would have been out the door much earlier. And that's why I think there was a question about P&G and what was P&G doing. Nowhere close to what Unilever was doing in the same product categories, in the same markets, completely different pathways. Completely different pathways. So culture matters, history matters, the timing of your entry matters, and going back to Marie's point, leadership matters.
Yeah.
Eob?
So I would have loved to ask him about some of the tensions that he might have faced when thinking about, I think he talked about a lot about like how now a lot of people are dying, say, from coronavirus, but a lot more people have been dying from like living in very dire conditions of poverty. And so he wants to address that, but I'm sure that comes with a lot of tensions. For instance, the case mentions the Vietnam case where Unilever was paying too little. And I'm sure some people would argue it's better than nothing. So if you hike the wages, then you're basically taking away from Vietnam's competitive advantage. And I think you talked about like factories that are sustainable, but can you build sustainable factories in poor regions? But if you don't, those poor regions probably won't have the capacity to catch up. So I would be curious to hear what he thinks about these tensions.
Yeah, and I think you've raised a very important point, Eob. And in conjunction with Vietnam, he mentioned Rana Plaza, which most of you are aware was a garment factory in Bangladesh that collapsed and killed, is it 3,000 people? Oishi, did I get the number right?
Officially around 2,700, official numbers.
Okay, all right. So, 2,700 to 3,000, maybe more, who knows? But 2,700, too many people. So now part of the tension here, and this is something that we actually talk about in the first strategy class here at Fletcher, that has to do with, and this is something that Paul also touched on, which is negotiating power. When you look at your supply chain, and you also look at your downstream parts and your upstream parts, the prices that you pay your suppliers, a lot of that is driven by what price you can negotiate, okay? So now if you are a company like Unilever or the Gap or your Walmart, you're this gigantic multinational companies and you're negotiating with a garment producer in Bangladesh, who's gonna have negotiating power? It's the big multinationals, right? So now the big multinational is operating in a space which is Lifebuoy soap or soup or detergents, which is a range of Unilever products. Or if you're Gap or Walmart in the the t-shirt division, you're dealing with basically t-shirts. Now these are all products that have relatively low margins, very little profitability. So the incentive for the large multinational is to use its negotiating power to drive down the prices that the supplier charges. Now you drive down the prices that a Bangladeshi textile manufacturer charges. What does the textile manufacturer, what option do they have? Well, they don't maintain their factories. They underpay their workers. I'm not talking about Bangladeshi garment workers. This is just true for supply chains all over the world when you are on the wrong side of the negotiating stick. So any choice to use your power to negotiate a better price and thereby get a larger margin actually has a domino effect all the way up the chain and down the chain. And what ends up happening is a factory building falls down and suddenly everybody is woken up and then you have to scramble to come up with a remedy. So there is a real tension. And this again comes back to, have you promised the shareholders a certain level of profitability? If I haven't, then I can say, okay, I'm actually going to take a lower margin here so that I can pay a better price to my suppliers. And coming back to a point I think that Drishti made about, say, a product like Fair and Lovely, or there are several other products that are actually not compatible with their mission. Axe, another one. There's very little that's sustainable in the brand, but those products are big sellers. They actually generate the margins. And remember, one part of our formula for maintaining investments in sustainable business is I need to find a tax base somewhere. I need to find a tax base somewhere. So I need to have some brands that actually generate a high margin so that I can afford a low margin someplace else. So that's a very, somewhat of a superficial response to the tension question that you raised, Eob. But that's the calculus that a lot of CEOs and brand managers need to go through. Lena?
Yeah, so I first wanted to just comment on Paul's conviction and the story that he has around the driving need to have this long-term strategy. And I think reading the case and just throughout the discussion, it was reiterated. And I'm not sure if that comes with just his tenure or what, but it was very impressive. But I guess my question then is, to what degree do we define a long-term within a strategy or as a strategy, and to what degree do we leave it undefined? Because it seems like, based on, you know, his sort of final thoughts there, that this needs to be the kind of strategy that's implemented beyond CSR, beyond shared value, moving forward with a lot of large corporations like Unilever. And so how do they navigate that long term, and how to sort of define it or undefine it, or leave it sort of as undefined?
It's a great question, Lena. Anybody like to take a shot at that? How would you define long term? Anyone?
I think one of the thing that he mentions when he talk about the tenure is that the CEO on average only stay 4.5 years, and they would try to do their best to fulfill the stakeholder need and demand in those years that they are in tenures. So I think he kept emphasis that he have a very long-term thinking, like beyond his tenure, what he gonna, or he leave the company. So I think defining what is the long-term impact for Unilever is what the CEO will leave after he finished his tenure.
Yeah, so Jean, I think that's a great way to sort of think about it. You know, which is, what is the legacy I leave behind, and include that as part of my long-term horizon.
Yeah.
The problem is that most CEOs, I'm talking about publicly traded companies, but it's true for smaller organizations as well. There is no guarantee that once you leave, that your quote-unquote legacy persists. There's no guarantee, simply because the pressures are always there, and you know, the strategy will change. Just like Paul, when he came in, he completely changed the strategy. So whoever was there before, whatever intent they had, he just sort of cleaned house, kicked out all the existing leadership and executives, and brought in different people. So you know that his successor, you know, is most likely to do something similar, if not as radical. So how do I think about the long term? So this is not an easy question, Lena and Jean. So one minimum thing to think about is long term. At the narrowest definition is, how long do I expect to be here? Okay, so if that 4.5 year horizon, that's just an average. That's just an average. There are some CEOs who are fired in a few months. Okay, and that 4.5 average is brought up by CEOs like Paul, who've been around for 10 years, or Ajay Banga, who we saw an interview with. He's been around for 10 plus years. Yeah. So they bring up the average. A lot of CEOs don't last that long. So for me to have a long term, I realize that if I'm going to be out in 18 months, it's no good having a long term that is 5 years long, because I won't be around to influence it. So then you have to figure out, how do I stay there long enough to see results for this complex strategy that I'm trying to unfold, and at the same time unfold that strategy. Now, if I start unfolding the strategy, my tenure could be reduced because the board just gets impatient, or your shareholders start revolting, or there's a takeover offer and you're out. So that is the delicate delicate balance, that fine line that you've got to walk. Now, an important thing that I would keep bringing you back to is, find that tax base. Find that tax base. And what do we mean by a tax base? A pool of goodwill, a pool of money, a pool of resources, a pool of friends, a pool of networks and relationships that you can dip into in order to buy yourself time. So we saw in the case of MasterCard, their very strong stock price performance gave Ajay Banga and his colleagues the opportunity to go for those adventures in Africa, in Nigeria and South Africa. Similarly, for Unilever, the cushion that Paul had initially was, he came in during a crisis. And he was coming into an Anglo-Dutch company, which was willing to look at this issue in a longer way. And then what he did was he implemented the USLP, and in the first few years, the program actually did really well. So people had faith that this is going to work. So you've got to watch all those metrics in order to lengthen the time that you have and do enough to keep that tax base rich and going. So the definition of a long term really is a tricky one. And Lena, the other thing that I find that more and more corporate organizations are turning to is they're looking to external benchmarks. So they're looking to their peers in the industry, whether it's within the same vertical, like consumer products, as in the case of Unilever, or across a benchmark of so-called, B Corps and other, kind of companies that are building a brand that is at the intersection of doing well and doing good. So if you use that standard and you repeat that standard in everything, then the board, the shareholders are actually willing to give you that extra room. And then you look at some studies which say, okay, a company that has a horizon that is 5 years or longer actually has better returns over a 5 to 10 year period. So you cite those studies. Those studies are really important because then that helps provide you some cover and helps give an actual number to what the long term is. Both the long term in terms of how you can deliver results and the long term over which the stock market can expect results. Okay, hopefully that provides some perspective. Rebecca?
Yes, sorry. I hope you don't mind that I keep my video off. I've been having some connectivity issues today.
No problem.
But this conversation actually reminded me of one we had in your strategic management class, Professor. So I hope you don't mind me looping that class into this discussion a little bit. On the second page of the case, it says that when it was talking about Unilever's genesis, it said that it was founded on the belief that a business would prosper only if it operated ethically and responsibly. And that reminded me of a discussion we had in the strategic management class around if businesses could lean into sustainability or adopt a sustainability strategy if it wasn't already sort of embedded in its DNA. And it seems to me that Unilever sort of already had that ethos embedded into its workings, despite the fact that Paul Polman came in and really dramatically shifted the strategy. It seemed as though there was already some level of awareness around the business's impact on society at large. So I'm just wondering if this sort of strategy that he enacted would even be possible in a company that didn't already have that sort of mindset built into the culture.
And what do you think?
Well, I think yes and no. It depends on the company. So when we talked about it in strategic management, we talked about it in respect to Zara and H&M that are fast fashion brands, and that the sort of whole concept of fast fashion is antithetical to sustainability. And so in my mind, a company like that who built their business model around something that's sort of, like antithetical to sustainability can't adopt sustainability practices because of the very nature of its business model. But maybe another company that is sort of more neutral, has a more neutral business model, would be able to adopt sustainability practices, but I think it would be a lot harder to engender buy-in from multiple stakeholders if there isn't already some sort of level of awareness or responsibility there.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, Rebecca, and a great set of observations in terms of reflecting on how we might answer that question. Here's something that I would like to leave you with, not just for this class, but beyond. All assumptions about any company should be on the table. So what do I mean by that? If you think about a company like Zara, which, even if you guys haven't read the case or a case on it, you kind of know what it is. I mean, if you are probably customers as well, And it's in the business of fast fashion. And the whole idea of fast fashion is you buy a product that is keeping pace with the fashion trends of the year, but I've sourced the materials quite cheaply. I've turned around the production very, very fast. And the idea is that this product is going to stay in your wardrobe for a short period of time, and then we'll move on, and you'll come back to a Zara store and buy the next thing that's in fashion. So essentially what you're doing is you're generating an enormous amount of product that is basically filling up landfills. So from a sustainability standpoint, while it was fantastic for Zara, it's terrible for the stakeholder that Paul mentioned, planet Earth. And so what does Zara do there? They have actually realized that that lack of sustainability in their core strategy is potentially a brand killer, especially for the target customers that they are trying to reach, which is people like yourselves, who are well-educated, urbane, discriminating buyers, and issues to do with filling landfills is pretty high on people's minds. So Zara has gone to a commitment to essentially revamp their entire approach to the supply chain and use recycled materials. So they are re-examining that assumption. Perhaps they will not get to their commitment, which I think it was like a 2030 commitment, that they were going to convert their entire supply to recycled materials. We'll see if they're going to get there, but at least they've made some noises which suggest that they are actually re-examining the fundamental model on which Zara is based. I'll give you one other example, again, to indicate why all assumptions should be on the table. And this is another company that you probably have not read a case on, but all of you know very well and are possibly avid consumers of the company, Facebook. So when we started out, with our understanding of Facebook, where it is, what is its product, what are its underlying values and ethos, over the last several years, there have been lots of questions and concerns about Facebook and does it really care about some of the larger negative consequences of its products, in some of the most vulnerable parts of the world, whether it's in Myanmar or it's in the poorer parts of the United States, for that matter. Now we're seeing, a steady evolution of Facebook in terms of fundamentally changing its business model and fundamentally changing those objectives and value systems. And sometimes it's being dragged kicking and screaming to a new construct. And sometimes there's external circumstances that are forcing it. So external circumstance was antitrust action and regulatory action in the European Union and in the United States. That was the last few years. This year, we were hit by the coronavirus. And one of the big issues with the coronavirus is even before the pandemic hits the developing world, the infodemic has hit the developing world. So we have more misinformation traveling across Nigeria and South Africa and Indonesia and India than the actual COVID virus itself. Now, why is that important? That information changes people's behaviors. And when it changes people's behaviors, we know from the experiences of South Africa to Italy, small changes in behaviors can have huge consequences in terms of the footprint of the virus, and it could have a catastrophic implication on countries like Indonesia, India, South Africa, and Nigeria. Now, Facebook has been one of the early movers in trying to corral that misinformation. They've actually taken a much harder line on what to keep in the system, what to keep out of the system. Of course, they're struggling with certain platforms like WhatsApp, which are much more difficult to police, but the core Facebook platform is among the cleanest platforms relative to YouTube or Twitter. So again, not saying that people have got this perfect, that there is the kind of leadership that we saw here for Unilever in Facebook, but companies do change, products do change, cultures do change. Sometimes the change is brought from within, sometimes the change is thrust upon them. So bottom line, all assumptions should be on the table. Kaylee?
This is really, really quick, but Ceres puts out a report every year called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty about water use in the food system. And I just thought it was interesting because that was one of the things that was pointed out in the case as a goal that they were having a hard time meeting. And Unilever is first globally and has been for the last 3 years. So whatever they did, it appears to have been pretty successful. It's also just a really interesting report if anyone is interested in water use in the food system.
Great. Yeah, I highly second that. Any other reflections? All right, we have Anne.
Sorry to bring in another thing. I know people are anxious to finish, but one thing that I wanted to hear a little bit more about, and I think is a challenge for a company of Unilever's size, is the relationship with suppliers, especially when you have so many. And he mentioned how they focus on the top 100 suppliers, and that's such a fraction of the amount of suppliers they're working with. And some of those suppliers are some of those smallholder farmers. And so it's sort of like, where's the connection between each end of the spectrum on the suppliers that are smallholder farmers versus those larger suppliers? And I also, I have heard that there is some, I don't want to say reputation, but one of the challenges of with Unilever is I've heard that they don't have a great relationship with suppliers because they're cutting costs. And this is not something I would have brought up, but it's something I've heard multiple times from people who've maybe been acquired by Unilever and how things have changed once they've been acquired by Unilever. And it's, it's not something they intend to do, but it's just a really big challenge with a company of that size that has so many products. What does that look like in the future for is it possible to extend beyond those top suppliers, or is there just going to be this gap where you're not able to address the smaller players in your value chain?
Yeah, I think, again, a really important set of issues, and thank you for bringing that up. And I think if you reflect on the supply chain challenge for Unilever, if they look at the top 100 cover about 60% of their supply chain. So focusing on the top 100 plays several important roles. Role number one is if I want to push a certain protocol up my supply chain, which says you need to reduce packaging by this much, water use by that much, environmental, greenhouse gases by that much, I can push that up if I have control over who the suppliers are and I have some visibility. So if I'm doing measurement and evaluation internally, I can send those same measurement and evaluation folks upstream and say, hey, you got to hire my Fletcher graduate who's going to do the measurement, and you got to do it. If you don't do it, I'm not going to get I'm not going to be your buyer, right? So you can have that kind of a conversation if you narrow the number of suppliers, which is what Unilever did, which is what a number of these companies that are committing to this kind of activity are doing. They went from thousands of suppliers to actually narrowing the number of suppliers. Also, what that does is it actually helps in basically evening out the asymmetry in bargaining power. So if you have a Unilever that's got thousands of suppliers, then any individual supplier is tiny relative to the gigantic multinational that Unilever is. Whereas if Unilever is corresponding primarily with 100 suppliers, those 100 suppliers may not be as large as Unilever. Some of them are, as Paul mentioned, Dow Chemical, which is a big company. It's nothing to be sneezed at. And then there are medium-sized companies which are part of that 100. So at least you have a little bit more symmetry, and thereby you have some more fairness and potentially some mitigation of the kind of risk and that you're talking about. Now, there's a very different proposition relative to the folks who are on the other side of the spectrum, the smallholder farmers, the tea picker. Those folks are in a very different bucket altogether. Now, what I thought was really interesting in Paul's observation was that he said, well, I focused on the 100 top suppliers, and I also focused on those little people. And I basically said I changed them from contract workers to being on the payroll, which is important. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing that gig worker The driver for my Uber, I'm making them an employee. It's the equivalent of that in the Unilever context, where the guy who's picking tea in the mountains of Assam or Darjeeling or in Kenya, they actually become a Unilever employee and potentially eligible for benefits and so on and so forth. So I'm no longer in the situation where I'm exploiting a low-cost labor. So it's important to look at both ends of the spectrum and actually eliminate the middle. That's really what a lot of very successful companies have done in terms of thinking about their supply chain, at least at a macro level. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, I know that it's been a long day, and I don't want to keep you here. And Oishi, you were doing the right thing. Get up, walk around, take your computer with you, because we definitely don't want anybody developing blood clots or just this part of your neck just completely freezing. So I know that we have some fascinating discussions up ahead, even more fascinating than today's, because you guys are going to be talking about your project next week. So a few things, if I could ask from all of you. I'm not going to have all of you sort of talk about where things are in terms of the projects and so on here in a wider forum. Please reach out to me and Uzair for any issues you'd like to discuss before the presentation, either in terms of process or content. Let's try to really focus on the content. I'm less fussed about the form in which it arrives. I'm hoping that we can generate some insights that we can all dig into, just like we dug into some insights today. That's point one. Use whatever medium and materials you will find helpful to share your learnings with the rest of the class. So if it's a PowerPoint presentation, have that ready to share screen. Point number three, let's reserve 3 hours. So we'll take breaks, but let's reserve 3 hours, as I had mentioned before, so that we can get through 4 teams next week and 4 teams the following week. If I had done this in our old beloved Mugar 200 classroom, I would have brought in food, and I would have brought in some very cheap but absolutely fantastic boxed wine. So what I would recommend is, we are on East Coast. Marie is in the middle of the morning, middle of the early morning, middle of the night, how we describe it. Whatever form of food you feel is appropriate, bring it to the table so that we can break bread together, as they say. Bring your beverage of choice. I'm going to get some really fantastic, really cheap boxed wine. I wish I could have shared that with you, but that's violating social distancing. So keep your own boxed wine ready, or any other beverage, and let's at least celebrate the time that we've had over the course of the last few weeks, and certainly the fact that that we're all thinking about these issues and are in a moment where we have the relative luxury to be able to reflect on problems that are within your reach to do something about, and you actually have the opportunity to do some of that reflection in a safe space and potentially learn from these external points of stimuli, whether it's the pre-cooked cases that I gave you or the cases that you are going to share with us based on the distant research that you've been able to do. So 3 hours, bring some food and beverage, keep that visible so that we can laugh about your snack choices or your dinner choices. And of course, make sure that you have something to share by Monday morning next week, so that we can at least read your preliminary ideas in a report before we come in, because don't waste time giving us the facts. Just like the case, don't waste time on what we had expected to have known. We will listen to your presentation. I'll send out a process for how much time to allocate for different things. And we will spend time actually digging into what you have learned. Finally, we have 8 teams. I will basically toss a coin and figure out which team goes in the first week and which team goes in the second week. If there is some logistical constraint that I should be aware of, let me know. I don't want to make this a hardship on top of everything that all of you are going through. So let me know so that I don't use the coin toss to allocate you on a week when it's actually not ideal. Okay, let me just sort of pause there. Have some questions from Ella and Marie. Ella, go ahead.
For this coin toss, will we know the results prior to next week? Or is this really going to be on the
I'm sorry, Ella, could you just repeat your entire question from the top?
Sure. I said the coin toss, will you be doing that on the spot, or will we have the results of that prior to next week?
Oh, yeah. Prior to next week. I'm not going to make you guys just come in without knowing whether you're going to do it or not. So you'll watch the Canvas announcements.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And Marie, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask for clarification about when the essay was due. When we first spoke with you before the break, you said that next Monday, but I just wanted to reconfirm what is the date of the physical paper itself.
So next Monday, I would ask all of you to share your first draft of your project so that we can read about your project in advance of coming into the presentation. So I'd like all 8 teams to do that by next Monday. Post the presentation and the discussion, you can refine whatever work you want to refine, modify it, incorporate any ideas that you got during the presentation and the discussion, and then give a final version to me and to Uzair. And I want to be honest about the date. I don't have the document in front of me. Did I actually give you a specific date by which that final version is due? I did not. Okay. So let me just sort of think about it, and I recognize the constraints that everybody is on, and I'll give you as much time as is doable, because I do want to give you guys a grade as well, those of you who are looking for a grade. So it's going to basically be before I have to actually grade you. So use that as your end date. Does that help?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So there's a blue hand which is basically showing some claps. Okay, I take that as a signal that, okay, get off, go out and breathe some fresh air, and if you have a dog, take it for a walk. And, it's so good to see all of you, and stay smiling, and stay healthy, and take care of people who need any kind of support, physical or mental. And you know where to reach me, and if there's any way in which I can be useful from a distance, let me know.
Professor, there's a hands up. Just to confirm.
Okay.
Just to confirm again, so the draft is due next Monday, and then the final version is TBD, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Anything else is there? Am I missing something?
No, Professor. So initially you mentioned the date regarding the final draft was due before the end of the semester or in the first week of final examination. But I guess now it has to be, I don't know, changed depending on your preferences.
Yeah, so here's what I would like you to do. I have to check when grades are due. So if you could get me your final versions 24 hours before the deadline for the grades, which is usually at noon time on the day before graduation. So I'll look all that up, and I'll put it on Canvas, so you'll have an exact time. So basically 24 hours before I have to turn in grades. That's your final time. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everybody.
If you have any questions, do reach out.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.